A young soldier walks into town, toward an inn and away from the trenches. But that night he hears an owl, and he knows that sound can mean only one thing: death. This is a reading, summary, and analysis of Edward Thomas's The Owl. Downhill I came, hungry and yet not starved, cold, yet had heat within me that was proof against the north wind, tired, yet so that rest had seemed the sweetest thing under a roof. Then at the inn I had food, fire, and rest, knowing how hungry, cold, and tired was I. All of the night was quiet, barred out except an owl's cry, a most melancholy cry, shaken out long and clear upon the hill. No merry note nor cause of merriment, but one telling me plain what I escaped, and others could not, that night as in I went. And salted was my food, and my repose salted and sobered too by the bird's voice speaking for all who lay under the stars, soldiers and poor, unable to rejoice. In the first stanza, the speaker tells us that they are in need of rest. They're not starving, they're not freezing, but rest sounds like the sweetest thing under a roof. And the inn can serve all of their wants and needs. In line 5, we see the inn had food, fire, and rest, knowing how hungry, cold, and tired was I. So you have this very nice, complete, like two sides to the coin: food, hungry, fire, cold, rest, tired. So the inn seems great, and all the night is blocked out, right? Barred out, defended against, except for the most melancholy cry of an owl. And this owl interrupts with reality. This hoped-for rest is pierced by the owl's cry, and the voice tells the speaker that they have escaped what others cannot. The voice continues through the poem, and the merriment is gone. It becomes salted and sobered, and the bird's voice speaks for all those soldiers and poor who are unable to rejoice. And I think that makes that idea of line 4, that rest seemed like the sweetest thing under a roof. The word seems to suggest some sort of revelation in the afterthought of what this owl has taught the speaker, that maybe rest isn't the sweetest thing under a roof. Maybe it's security or peace, that you can't get to rest if you don't have one of those two things, and the poor and the soldiers certainly don't. Now we'll get back to some of the details about the meaning of the poem in a little bit, but I want to take a second to look at the sounds of the poem. So first off, you see this rhyme scheme, this A, B, C, B, C, D, E, D sort of rhyme scheme. That pattern more or less continues with one exception there. So we get this sort of rhythm going in the poem, but it's also quite interrupted. So I kind of feel like it has an uncomfortable momentum. You never quite get into the rhythm of the poem, but you can sense that there's one there. And the poem starts with a really strong rhythm. You get this almost anaphora: hungry and yet not starved, cold yet had heat within me, tired yet so that rest had seemed. So this repetition really gets the poem moving, and this is enforced in the meter of the poem as well. The poem starts with 2 lines with stressed stanzas: downhill I came, hungry and yet not starved, cold yet had heat within me. And usually when you start with a trochee or just not an iamb, when you start with a stressed syllable, it really pushes the poem forward. You get this really sort of driving force, but that doesn't continue in the poem. At other points, the poem falls into iambic pentameter. At the end of the poem, we can see, and salted was my food and my repose salted. So it goes into iambic pentameter, but then we are hit with a trochee again, by salted and sobered too by the bird's voice speaking for all who lay under the stars, soldiers and poor, unable to rejoice. So these like sort of just pounding notes where the iambs are broken up by trochees or just stresses in the wrong spot really kind of, to me, feels like the owl's voice. Like you can't rest. For an English listener, iambic pentameter is quite comfortable. We're said that it mirrors a heartbeat. It kind of suits our natural speech patterns. A lot of songs, a lot of poems, a lot of hymns are in iambs. And it's not that they come completely naturally, but they feel natural, at least. So when they get interrupted by salted and soldiers, it interrupts our comfort in the poem, our restful state in the poem. Shakespeare does this to marvelous effect with the witches in Macbeth who speak in trochees as opposed to iambs, and their words like double, double, or liver, or whatever words they use feel very jolting. And that's exactly why Shakespeare did that way, and I would argue that's what Edward Thomas is doing here. We are never able to rest, just like the speaker is not able to rest. There's a lot of other interesting poetic devices going on in here, including a lot of alliteration that really adds that emphasis and pacing, albeit broken up pacing again. But I want to go back to Macbeth for a little bit here, because you might be wondering about the title bird in our poem, the owl. So owls hold a unique place in nature. They're nocturnal birds, which is pretty rare in like the northern hemisphere areas where owls are more prevalent, and they hunt silently. They have large eyes and they move their heads nearly completely around, so they can be kind of startling. So this almost silent, large-eyed, quite loud bird, they fly silently, but when you hear them, like a screech owl or something, it is quite jolting. And perhaps because of all this, it should be no surprise that in English literature at least, the owl has become a symbol of death. In Macbeth, it is a clear omen before characters die. There is often an owl heard screeching. I think this is an image Edward Thomas would be abundantly aware of, and he uses it so well. There's enjambment at the end of this stanza, second stanza, where the owl cries. So we don't read it as an owl's cry, a most melancholy cry, shaken out long and clear. Instead, you keep on moving. There's a pause, a slight one, because there's a stanza break, but it moves. You don't get to rest at the end of that stanza. You don't get to rest with the owl's cry. It immediately shakes us out. So it's an owl's cry, a most melancholy cry, shaken out long and clear upon the hill. No merry note. So we just don't get a chance to rest. And this is a wonderful example of the music, the poetic devices, the rhythm, the alliteration, all that sort of stuff, working with the meaning of the poem. And I think that's one of the things that great poems do. The meaning and the music work in tandem together. Now, The Owl is one of those poems that is really tied to its writer. It's hard to talk about this poem without talking about the author. If you've watched any of my past poetry videos, you know that I shy away a little bit from biographical criticism because I think it can get in the way of a good reading of a poem. But here I think it's really important. And a little bit about Edward Thomas. He took the long road to poetry. For years, he worked as an essayist and a critic, and it wasn't until the eve of the Great War, World War I, and after some encouragement from a young Robert Frost, that Thomas turned to verse. Thomas only saw one volume of poetry published under a pseudonym during his lifetime. The Owl was not in that collection. And perhaps that's why his poetry feels so organic. A writer so entrenched in long form suddenly writing in the shortest form we have, just as time for both him and much of the world was about to grow short. Thomas wrote all of his poetry from 1914 to 1917. He enlisted in the British Army in 1915 and was killed in action in April of 1917. He was 39, a loving husband, and a father to 3 children. And as a poet, he was almost completely unknown. And so it's no surprise that The Owl is usually read as a war poem. Many readers interpret it as a soldier heading into town on leave whose company, as suggested by the owl's melancholy cry, suffers tremendous losses and death, that he survives it because he wasn't there. The introduction of this video suggests this speaker as soldier framing, but that's not the only way to read this poem. In his article for The Guardian, Carlo Rumens highlights the other group Thomas addresses at the end of the poem. The reference to the poor opens the poem out beyond its occasion, and beyond the First World War in which Thomas was to die. The autobiographical voice initially underlines its honesty, but the owl becomes something more by its final resistance to autobiography, by a kind of unselfishness and fact. And so this short lyric reaches beyond limits of time, place, and personality. It continues to summon a world we know, one in which too many people are at war and far too many are destitute. Regardless of the poem's intended context, it shows a lyrical connection to reality that few other poems get to. The figurative and literal are both on full display. The military and the civilian are intertwined in a way that makes it impossible to ignore the war and poverty of the world, even if you're sleeping safely in a cozy inn. Thomas was not writing under any grandeur of immediate fame or fortune, and perhaps that's why this experienced writer turned a novice poet wrote with such creativity and truth. Over 100 years after his death, his literary reputation continues to grow, and The Owl remains perhaps his most enduring poem. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video, or at least found it interesting. If so, please check out some other ones, and I'll see you in the next one. Happy reading.